John O'Naylor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a great privilege for me to be able to rise and take a call on this, the Human Rights Amendment Bill, at its second reading. I refer to New Zealand's proud history in the area of human rights. I took great privilege when I was at the conference or seminar that was mentioned by the previous speaker in Manila less than 2 weeks ago. It was a great trip, I can tell you. It was very interesting to share the stage with those people. But I took great pride in being able to talk about New Zealand human rights issues, the fact that, and our history, the fact that we were in fact the first nation to give women the vote, for example. And in hearing some of the things that I've heard talked about here, people have said, that we should just sit on what we've got. People are saying, we've got a good Human Rights Commission, we've got this structure in place, and this is very good, and we should rest on our laurels perhaps and stay there. And Mr. Speaker, I find that a little disturbing, because I think if we're not going to continuously improve what we are doing, if we're not going to continue to amend our legislation to make it better, to make it stronger, to deliver an even better human rights record in New Zealand than what we have, that would be very sad. And I can't help but reflect what would have happened if we'd simply patted ourselves on the back in the fashion that I've heard so far this evening from the opposite side, and said, well, we've given women the vote, let's just stop there. I think that would be ridiculous. We've moved on so much further. We've been able to achieve so much more, and that is why it is important that we have a Human Rights Amendment Bill for us to do even more to further enhance the human rights of the people living in New Zealand. Mr. Speaker, at that conference that I attended, it was really interesting to be able to share the stage and share some time with many countries whose human rights record is not the same as our own. I found it rather ironic at times to be sitting next to people who, for example, had refugees leave their nation to come and live in my hometown of Palmerston North. And I thought it seemed a little odd to be in that situation, but it was a great opportunity for us to be able to share, and my colleagues Peony Hanare and Marama Fox were able to also talk about some of the lessons that we'd learnt in terms of our Indigenous people and what we'd learnt in terms of the role of women within our society and addressing some of those issues. But my responsibility and the topic that I'd been given was to talk about New Zealand's response to the periodic review which is conducted every 4.5 years by the United Nations. And that periodic review highlights a bunch of recommendations. There were a significant number actually for New Zealand, and we've heard people talking about how the fact that we can sort of stop where we are, we don't need to move forward, when in fact there were 155 recommendations that those other nations had to suggest to us that we could move forward. And we've picked up on about 120 of those, and we're starting to incorporate some of those into the practice here, and looking forward to the Human Rights Commission coming up with their action plan in July of this year. But Mr. Speaker, it can't stop there. We need to continue to move forward. And while those countries, as the previous speaker said, perhaps were in awe of what we had achieved over this recent time, they were envious, in fact, of our Human Rights Commission, and even had countries approaching us saying, how might we be able to set one up in our own nation? Mr. Speaker, I think those people would be somewhat disturbed if we said we've come as far as we can go and we don't need to move on, we don't need to make further progress. And so, Mr. Speaker, this amendment is about continuous improvement. It's about the establishment of having a commissioner who was going to be sort of set aside in the work that they do in the role of disabilities. And I know, Mr. Speaker, from my previous experience as a mayor of Palmerston North, the number of times when I would be confronted by people from our community who were facing issues around disability, whether it be about access to public buildings, whether it's about all of the other issues that perhaps people in our communities are facing where they're discriminated on the basis of disability, it is critically important that our Human Rights Commission has an absolutely designated person involved to be able to work in that area with some specialist knowledge to assist those people in our community who need that assistance and provide the advocacy that is required from somebody in that role. But Mr. Speaker, when I think about people and they talk about being discriminated against, people don't want to be defined necessarily all the time simply by their race or by their age or by their gender or by their disability. And so it sort of seems ironic to me that in fact if we're going to have a Human Rights Commission which is trying to get away from discrimination, that we're actually going to have separate titles for people, that they're the EEO Commissioner, or they're the Disability Commissioner, or they're whatever else specific Commissioner. Let's reflect those in the titles. Yes, it's not necessarily in terms of the work that they do, it might be specific, it might be specialised, because it will take a certain amount of specialised knowledge. But it doesn't mean that we necessarily have to keep using the titles. I can't understand why everyone's so upset really over titles, because at the end of the day it is the function of the Human Rights Commissioners, it is the function of the work that they're doing to ensure that we have got those bases covered, which is really what is important. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker alluded to the fact that around half of the people who submitted on this bill were opposed to it. And it was sort of described that was a significant number. Well, if you're going to talk about half, well, actually, the other half are just as significant. And so half of the people agreed with what was being proposed. And in my experience, Mr. Speaker, it's often the people who do come and make submissions, whether it be to council plans or to bills, are usually the people who think there's something wrong with it. Because the people who think that it's okay tend not to speak up. And also, at the end of the day, we can't simply base our decisions on the number of submissions that we receive, either for or against any particular piece of legislation. We need to weigh it up on the basis of the quality of what's presented. And so, Mr. Speaker, we needed to give our Human Rights Commission some flexibility. Yes, they're an independent body. They need to be able to work in a way that reflects what they believe needs to be achieved. And there's been a little bit of a talk about whether or not they're going to be told what to do by the Prime Minister or the relevant minister. Well, it makes sense to me, Mr. Speaker, that they have an ability to consult and to talk and have a conversation. No one is talking about giving up the independence of the Human Rights Commission, but we are talking about ensuring that we do have communication lines open and ensuring that those people who are responsible for making legislation that will affect this Commission do have a direct line of communication. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think that's very important also. So, look, it's one of those things really where we could talk, and there's been a lot of banter and discussion from people really nitpicking over some of the specific things, whether it be job titles or otherwise. But in my mind, it really has to be about, are we going to have a Human Rights Commission which is going to be improving? Is it going to be delivering better results for New Zealanders? Is it going to ensure that it's flexible, that it's adaptable, that it's able to meet the needs of New Zealanders? And Mr. Speaker, that is what this amendment is about. It's about us ensuring that those people who need the services of the Human Rights Commission will have those needs met in the most appropriate way. Mr. Speaker, one of the things that we were talking about a lot in Manila was the human rights conventions that are international conventions. And this amendment absolutely wants to ensure that New Zealand is better equipped to meet those requirements that we voluntarily join up to when we sign some of those various UN conventions. And Mr. Speaker, if we're not going to, if we see an opportunity to enhance what we're doing, if we see an opportunity to make sure that we comply in a better way with those UN conventions and ignore it, Mr. Speaker, well, it's a little bit like sort of looking at yourself in the mirror and then going away and forgetting what you look like. It's a little bit like just, I don't know, really disregarding yourself and disregarding what you stand for. So I think it's critical that when we see these opportunities, we make the amendments to the legislation to ensure that we do fulfil those things that we say with the UN that we will do. And Mr. Speaker, I think by making these amendments to ensure that the Human Rights Commission is better equipped to deal with that, when we ensure that our Human Rights Commission has the right kind of roles in terms of best meeting the needs of New Zealanders, then that's exactly what we need to do. And so on that point, Mr. Speaker, I want to finish and commend this amendment bill to the House. Thank you.